President Trump is not happy with NATO. Yes, he's said this a few times during this war. It came up again over the course of the last day, having to do with the blockade of the Straits of Hormuz that the Americans decided to implement, that President Trump decided to implement starting today, and the NATO countries not wanting to be a part of it. So we're going to explore all of that, and also try to look downrange a little bit and think about what the NATO alliance might look like going forward when all is said and done on this war. So let's take a look at some of these headlines here on this topic. NATO allies refuse to join Trump's Iranian port blockade. Britain and France refuse to join blockade. Macron proposes multinational mission to restore navigation. NATO allies seek diplomatic non-military solutions. That's the summary. Reuters, April 13th, NATO allies said on Monday they would not get involved in U.S. President Donald Trump's plan to blockade Iranian ports, proposing to intervene only once the fighting ends, in a move likely to anger Trump and increase strains on the alliance. Trump said that the U.S. military would eliminate any Iranian ships that came near the blockade that began on Monday after weekend talks failed to reach an agreement to end the 6-week conflict with Iran. And here's Trump yesterday, or is this earlier? Or early this morning. It's dark outside. I think it's last night. Here's Trump on the topic.
Well, they're coming up. They're going to be coming up. But I'm very disappointed in NATO. They didn't do this. They weren't there for us. We pay dollars for NATO, and they weren't there for us. Remember what I said. NATO was not there. Now they want to come up. But there's no real threat anymore. But NATO was not there for us.
$1 trillion for NATO. That's what America pays. $1 trillion for NATO. And Trump is pointing it out again. They were not there for us. They were not there for us. And then we have this report, which came out in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post. A lot of different places reported it. This is the Jerusalem Post's take on it. Trump weighs punishing certain NATO countries over lack of Iran war support. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said on Wednesday, this is from last week. So this current issue where the NATO countries said today that they're not going to participate in the blockade, they're going to wait until the fighting is over, they're not going to help out. This comes a week after NATO Secretary General visited Washington, D.C. and met with President Trump. Okay? And he said on Wednesday that he believes some NATO countries were tested and failed. So let's take a look. This is a story from last week. The Trump administration. So this is not after the current problem with the blockade. This is last week. Look at this. The Trump administration is considering a plan to punish some members of the NATO alliance that he believes were unhelpful to the U.S. and Israel during the Iran war, the Wall Street Journal reported on Wednesday, citing administration officials. The proposal would involve moving U.S. troops out of NATO member countries deemed unhelpful to the Iran war effort and stationing them in countries that were more supportive of the U.S. military campaign, the report added. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said on Wednesday he believes that some NATO countries were tested and failed amid Washington's criticism over European allies not getting involved in the war. And those comments came after he met with Trump at the White House. And he was asked, he was asked if he believed NATO countries were tested and failed. Some of them, yes, but a large majority of European countries, and that's what we discussed today, have done what they promised before in a case like this. The White House did not disclose details of the talks. Trump posted on Truth Social after the meeting in capitalized letters that NATO wasn't there when we needed them and they won't be there if we need them again. Think about that. Mark Rutte flies to Washington, D.C. to meet with Trump to try to smooth things over because Trump has been trash-talking NATO for not being helpful, for being the opposite of helpful throughout this war. So last week, Rutte comes to D.C., meets with Trump. He admits in front of the media that there were some NATO nations that might have failed, but for the most part, everyone behaved properly. And after the meeting, Trump posted on Truth Social, NATO wasn't there when we need them. And now this week, 5 days after that meeting, they refused to join the blockade. And Trump is saying again the clip that I just showed you, Trump is again reminding everyone that NATO's been disappointing. So you don't have to read between the lines too much to know that the meeting with Rutte did not go that well. Trump and NATO's Mark Rutte met at the White House on Wednesday as the war has pushed the alliance to a crisis point. The Republican president has threatened to withdraw from the 32-member transatlantic alliance and denounced Washington's European allies in recent weeks for what he said was inadequate support. Okay. Trump said on Tuesday the attacks would be paused, a 2-week ceasefire. Here we go. Quote, "It's quite sad that NATO turned their backs on the American people over the course of the last 6 weeks when it's the American people who have been funding their defense," said White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. Trump has called for countries that depend on oil from the Gulf region to break Iran's chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz. But the European countries are unlikely to join mine clearing or other missions to free up navigation as long as hostilities continue, according to 2 European diplomats. Think about this. Iran is illegally charging tolls and saying that they control the Straits of Hormuz. And the European nations are willing to take that. They're willing to just be whipping boys. They'd be willing to pay the tolls and give Iran sovereignty over the Straits of Hormuz, which are international waters. Probably they wouldn't lift a finger to stop that. They have no will to defend themselves at all. NATO, which includes European countries, the US and Canada, was formed in 1949 to counter the Soviets. Very nice. In recent weeks, Trump has called them a paper tiger. Asked by a Reuters reporter earlier this month about withdrawing from NATO, Trump said, "Wouldn't you if you were me?" Look at that. He's really serious. Okay. And then here in the Middle East Eye, not a this is a very anti-Israel outlet, but the Middle East Eye, they do some good pieces. Trump says, meaning good journalism, even though I don't like their stance. Trump says U.S. spending on NATO under serious examination. This is from today. Look at that. U.S. President Donald Trump said American spending on NATO will be under very serious examination, criticizing the alliance for what he described as a lack of support. They weren't there for us. You know, we spend trillions of dollars on NATO to help them guard really against Russia. When you think of it, we're guarding against Russia. And I've long thought it was a little ridiculous, but we spend trillions of dollars doing it. And I think that's going to be under very serious examination, he said. And let's get back to the fact that they refused to join the blockade of the Straits of Hormuz. So in modern diplomacy, we see this story: Trump's Strait of Hormuz blockade plan fails as NATO allies refuse to join. Now, why does it say it fails? Okay, it increased tensions within the alliance, that's for sure. The United States NATO allies announced Monday they would not participate in his plan to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, increasing tensions with the alliance. Trump stated the U.S. military would collaborate with other nations to block maritime traffic in the waterway, following unsuccessful talks to resolve the ongoing conflict with Iran. Okay, he said he would have partners, NATO allies, including Britain and France, emphasized the importance of keeping the waterway open, through which 1/5 of the world's oil flows, and clarified that they would not take part in the blockade. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer declared his decision not to engage in the conflict despite considerable pressure. They're fine paying illegal protection money tolls, like mafia protection money, to the Iranians. Remember, let's make this clear. I've said this in other videos in the last couple of days. The Straits of Hormuz are not Iran's territorial waters. They're international waters. Iran's on one side. On the other side of the Straits of Hormuz is the UAE, Oman, Saudi Arabia is there. That's who's on the other side of the Straits of Hormuz. They have no right by international law to be policing it or taking tolls or anything else. It's not theirs. So the whole idea that it's even a discussion that the Iranians could have some measure of control, who they allow through, who they don't allow through, charging tolls, making billions of dollars off the Straits of Hormuz. That's all illegal. That's like a mobster. I called it mafia protection money because it's just like a mafia guy walking into it, the classic case where he walks into a shop in the neighborhood and says, if you pay us protection money, nothing will happen to you. And the people that you're protecting against are the people you're paying the money to. It's mafia tactics. These guys, these Europeans, have no will to fight it. Sorry. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte indicated that Trump is seeking specific commitments from European nations to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. While some European countries expressed willingness to assist, they conditioned their support on a permanent end to hostilities and an agreement ensuring their ship's safety. They're trying to protect the Iranian regime. They don't want to bring it down. They're not interested. French President Emmanuel Macron announced plans to organize a conference with Britain and others to establish a multinational mission to restore the navigation. Now look at this. Look at this end of the story. The Turkish foreign minister, Hakan Fidan, advocated for a diplomatic approach to reopen the strait and urged NATO to improve its relationship with Trump in a summit scheduled for July in Ankara. Look at that. There's a NATO summit taking place in Turkey this year. Now, Turkey is a NATO member. It's kind of crazy that Turkey's a NATO member because they have a very close working relationship, including on some defense equipment with Russia, who NATO was designed to counter. And in general, just like their alignment with the Muslim Brotherhood and jihadists ideology and anti-American and anti-Western and certainly anti-Israel forces all around. Their support of Hamas, their housing, their hosting of Hamas leadership, and yet they're a NATO member, and they're hosting the NATO summit. And I saw that. I found it interesting, especially when you think about where Europe is headed here. Why are the Europeans so? It's more than hesitant. They're so resistant to getting involved in any way whatsoever, even to the point of diplomatic crisis. If the United States pulls out of NATO, NATO falls apart. Their own national defense is at stake. They're not willing to lift a finger. You know why? Because of everything we're talking about Europe, the Islamification of Europe. They have their voter bases are anti-Israel, are anti-West, are pro-Iran. Of course, NATO's not going to do anything. NATO, you'd think that native Europeans would be the first ones to want to step up and push back against the forces of jihad and the forces of an Islamic regime that is trying to take down the West. They're the countries that are being destroyed by Islam right now. But it's just the opposite. All they want to do is capitulate to it. And that has everything to do with Turkey's status. They're hosting the NATO summit. Couldn't be more perfect. Look at this story here. This is a story in the a Reuters story. I'm just reading it. I guess it was reprinted in the Jerusalem Post. That's where I saw it from today. Turkey says NATO should reset ties with Trump at next summit. Prepare for the future. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said he understood Trump's frustrations with the alliance, but that a large majority of European nations had been helpful. Right, that's the statement we saw before. But look at this. Turkey said on Monday that NATO allies should use their July summit in Ankara to reset ties with President Trump and prepare for a potential reduction of U.S. involvement in the alliance. Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said that Turkey believed Trump would attend the summit due to his personal respect for Erdogan, but added that he understood Trump was otherwise reluctant to come to the meeting. Why is he making that statement? Why is he putting that out there, that Trump was reluctant to come but is going to come out of respect to Erdogan? This is a power play by the Turks. The Turks are hosting the NATO meeting. Erdogan's getting out in front of this story and saying, if Trump's going to pull out, we should think about how to plan for the future and how to reset the relationship. And he's really only coming out of respect to us. Fidan told state-owned Anadolu news agency that allies had long considered Trump's criticisms to be rhetoric, but we're now planning around the possibility of reduced U.S. involvement and ramping up their own defensive capacities. NATO countries need to turn this Ankara summit into an opportunity to put ties with the United States on a systematic basis. If there will be a U.S. withdrawal from some NATO mechanisms, there needs to be a plan and program to phase this out so nobody is left in the open, he added. A senior White House official told Reuters, as a part of his frustration with NATO, that Trump, as part of his frustration with NATO, had also considered the option of removing some U.S. troops from Europe. The U.S. has about 85,000 troops in Europe. And, the expenditure is $1 trillion, and people complain about 3.8 billion to Israel because that's called aid. NATO isn't called aid. It's aid to all of Europe. All of Europe, all those countries in Europe get more aid than Israel gets, each one of them, if you divide up the NATO expenditure. In any event, I digress. The point here is that look at the role that Turkey is assuming. Erdogan has big designs on the world. He's the Muslim Brotherhood guy. The European countries that are becoming Islamified, let's project forward a little bit. As they become more and more Muslim friendly, and as more and more elected officials in those countries are Muslims, Turkey's role as the large Muslim base in NATO is going to grow. They're now hosting the NATO summit at this moment, talking about planning for the future at this Ankara summit, signaling that they're the power players in NATO now going forward. And as Europe becomes more Muslim, that's going to be a natural relationship. This is getting interesting. I think in some ways it only underscores the truth of what Trump is saying, that NATO will never be there to back up America, because Europe is going to become increasingly anti-American as it becomes increasingly Islamic. So I think that's the subtext of this whole NATO situation with Trump. I think that's where some of this is headed. And let's watch for Turkey to be making more statements like this. This is what I'm looking for downrange. When I'm following a news story, I always try to look downrange and imagine what the possibilities might look like, because then if things are different than what you expected, or they're in line with what you expected, you learn something. So that's what I'm looking for, is to see how Turkey continues to play this, because they're trying to position themselves as a regional, as the superpower. And of course, Erdogan must be thrilled about the Islamification of Europe, and he's looking to play a bigger and bigger role in NATO. This also might signal that maybe it's not the greatest idea in the world for the United States to pull out of NATO, because when you pull out of NATO, you also lose the influence. On the other hand, you could also argue maybe you don't even want that influence anymore. It's a very interesting question. But I think that we should not separate the Islamification of Europe and all the demographic stuff about Muslim takeover. We shouldn't separate that from our analysis of the political behavior of European leaders when it comes to things like standing up to the Islamic regime in Tehran, to their behavior vis-a-vis Israel, their behavior vis-a-vis the Middle East in general. So this is getting really interesting. All right, thanks for watching. I hope you found this edifying and interesting. These days you need to stay on top of the news. You need to stay on top of what is out there. And thank you for using my channel to do that. Make sure to also follow the Israel 365 News channel, but also the Israel365news.com website. It's a news website. You can go there, sign up for that. And in the description of this video, hopefully, I hope it's getting added, should be added. There's a sign up link to sign up for the Israel 365 News newsletter and the Israel 365 Action newsletter. With one link, you can sign up for both of them. And that will keep you informed, because these days you can't rely on truth about Israel and the Middle East coming to you organically. You really need to seek it out. And if you click that link, go ahead and click that, sign up for the newsletters, and you will get good analysis and reporting from Israel and the Middle East, and keep you informed in this information war that we are in. All right, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and all that jazz, and God bless.